Evolution is a conservative process. Everything about you is built on ancient foundations, right? Very little new, certainly very little radically new comes into existence. It's mostly tinkering with structures that have been around forever, like your body plan, for example. That's unbelievably old. I mean, you share that with lizards, roughly speaking. So it's incredibly ancient. So, you know, when you share bilateral symmetry, even with most invertebrates. So those things are extraordinarily old. And so for our ancestors, what was down out of the tree, let's say, down in the grass, that was the thing that lurked in the unknown. Well, for us, the idea of the unknown has become much more abstractly conceptualized. Like, we can think of the unknown as such, things we don't know. And so then we can think of the abstract predator. And the abstract predator is the thing that lurks in the unknown that always confronts us. Now, because people are strange and complex creatures, and because we're partly predators and partly prey animals, we don't only conceptualize the thing that lurks in the unknown as a devouring predator. We also conceptualize it as something that offers possibility, because we've learned that if we go into the unknown, we can find things that we need for now and for the medium and for the long term. It can be beneficial for us to confront the things that we don't know. And that's human beings in a nutshell. That's what we do. And so that's the basis. That's why I believe that's the most archetypal story. Because it fundamentally characterizes our mode of being in the world. We're information foragers. We go out into the unknown, the terrifying unknown, and we gather things of value. Which, it's not much different than squirrels foraging for nuts, really. You know, and we use exactly the same biological systems to go out and forage for information that squirrels use when they go out and forage for nuts. So I guess the system developed in part because we were fruit eaters as well, and so we found trees that had ripe fruit in them and learned where they were and how to gather them. And then you see a tight relationship there between information and food, right? There's almost no difference between eating and knowing where the food is. And as soon as so our systems of knowing where things are grew massively. And so that turned us into the kind of abstract creatures that we are. So we're always looking for ways of producing more of what we need. That's a good way of thinking about it. And we do that abstractly. So, all right, so when you encounter something that's anomalous, something unexpected, so, you're in a relationship that you're not that happy about, it's a good example, and the person that you're with is suddenly much colder to you than usual. Okay, now the question is that good news or bad news? And the answer is, well, it's good news insofar as you're not that happy with the relationship. So it's bad news insofar as you want the relationship to continue. And so very frequently it's the case that you're somewhat ambivalent about the frame that you inhabit, and so anomalous information has a twofold meaning. It's like, well, now I can finally get out of this. That's one way of thinking about it. And if the person is particularly cold and distant to you, and maybe even insulting, then half of you is going to be very upset because this is happening, and the other half is, roughly speaking, is going to be saying, oh, this is just the opportunity I wanted. And what that means is you're in your frame that constitutes the relationship, let's say, and the story you've laid out about it. The novel event occurs, and it produces activation in two competing systems. One is the positive system that explores for new opportunities, and the other is the threat system that paralyzes you because your current mode of conceptualization is no longer valid. And so anomaly has this deeply ambivalent nature. And one of the things that I've tried to understand for a long time is how you compute that. And it seems to me that you need to consider it in relationship to this hierarchical value structure that we've talked about before. So you might say that, imagine your nervous system is tuned so that if anomalous things happen at high resolution levels, you produce a very small amount of negative emotion and a comparatively large amount of curiosity. Because the thing that's being threatened by the anomalous event isn't that big, and so the possibility that information lurks there that might be useful is high compared to the threat. Whereas generally speaking, if you encounter something, maybe you go into a store one day and on a whim you shoplift something in a, a fit of stupid impulsivity and you get caught. That happened to there was an NDP member of parliament 20 years ago who did exactly that. He had a pretty good reputation. He went into a department store, swiped something, some gloves or something, I don't even remember what it was, and got caught. It's like, well, that's sufficiently anomalous behavior or occurrence to make you question whether or not you're actually a good person. And so it's almost as if at the higher resolution levels of the value structure, if something anomalous occurs, then it's either neutral or tilted slightly towards positive, and at the higher levels, at the more abstract and comprehensive levels, if something anomalous happens, then it's more likely to blow out large portions of the systems you use to organize the world, and it's going to be experienced as negative. And partly what you're trying to do when something anomalous occurs is to do a search up and down this value structure. You have an argument with someone that you love. Well, what does that mean? Maybe you're arguing about how you interact with each other when one of you comes home. You'd like a kiss and a hug at the door, and they'd just as soon sit there and watch TV. So you have an argument about that. Okay, what does the argument mean? Does it mean that some little thing has to be adjusted at the level of micro detail? Or does it mean, the person that you've tangled up your life with really doesn't care for you at all and is a complete jerk and you should leave? Well, a big part of the argument is going to be, how do we construe the occurrence? How do we construe the occurrence? Is it a major event or a minor event? And my advice would be, unless there's strong reason, presume it's a minor event and start operating at that level, because otherwise every argument becomes a catastrophe. And if that's the case, you actually can't solve any problems. You won't be able to discuss anything, right? Because as soon as you bring up an anomaly, something unpleasant, the other person will assume that everything's over and get so shorted out that you won't be able to talk with them. So those are the sort of people who will cry if you bring up anything negative, right? And so they're threatened by their value, you might say their value structure so fragilely constructed, and maybe they're not standing on enough pillars so that anything you toss at them that's a question is enough to shake the entire structure to its foundations. Or maybe they're acting that out just to manipulate you. That's another option. So anyways, partly what you seem to be doing when you're thinking about something is to shift your frames of reference up and down your value hierarchy to constrain the occurrence and to determine the degree to which it's positive and the degree to which it's negative. It's also complicated too, because whether something is positive or negative depends on the frame of reference that you bring to bear on it, right? And so that's why I was saying earlier about the relationship. If you're ambivalent about the relationship and something negative happens, something disruptive, it's certainly possible to adopt a frame of reference almost immediately that makes that into something positive. You say, well, I was done with this anyways. I'm glad you said that because it gives me the excuse I needed to terminate this. And so it's a very strange thing that you can shift the emotional valence of almost anything, by shifting your frame of reference. There are boundaries. You can teach animals pleasure to electric shocks, painful electric shocks, if you pair them reliably with the provision of something intensely rewarding. Cocaine, for example, or hypothalamic stimulation. They can learn to associate pain with something good and respond positively to it, to work for it. So when you see this in you even a little bit, some of you have no doubt learned to eat foods that aren't really edible, like olives are a good example of that, or coffee. They're bitter. And generally speaking, poisonous things tend to be bitter. And people don't really like bitter things. But if you train yourself, you can get to the point where I taught my daughter how to eat olives when she was very young, and I bet her, I think she was only 3, I bet her that she couldn't eat 20 olives over the next week or something. And she'd always respond to a challenge. And so, the first 3 olives, it was not a fun experience for her because her face, kids have a lot of taste buds, her face would get all crinkled up and she just wasn't enjoying it now. But I paid for that desperately later in my life because I used to go to this specialty shop and buy these particularly good spicy olives, by the quart, and if they were in the fridge she'd come home and just devour the entire quart like a mad bulimic. I mean, on olives, for God's sake. And so then I never got any of them, so it served me right, exactly. But the point is, you can rewire yourself quite completely by placing negative things in a positive context, and the degree to which you can do that is quite remarkable. You can't there seems to be limits beyond which your ability to turn pain into pleasure, for example, is compromised. I don't think anybody's ever going to learn how to associate being seriously burnt by something hot with something pleasurable, right? And I don't know how the systems exactly adjust themselves so that there are limits to, you know, how you can transform an emotional stimulus, because you can transform them quite remarkably, but obviously there's some boundaries that we don't understand very well. So, all right, so roughly speaking, we could say that the degree to which something is experienced as utter chaos is proportionate to the level of the value hierarchy that anomalous event is construed or experienced to disrupt. And you really see this happening in people who are depressed. Because you might think, here's another way of thinking about it. You might think, well, am I a good cook? You're asking yourself. You fail at cooking something, so you think, well, am I capable of completing a meal? And you might say, well, if all you've done is set the table badly, probably the right thing to do is to learn how to set the table and not to question your ability to complete a meal. So then you might say, okay, well, when should you move up one level of abstraction? We might say, well, imagine there's 5 things that you need to do at this level in order to successfully complete that level. So you have to cut vegetables, you have to set the table, you have to do the dishes in order to complete a meal. And so you break 6 dishes, you burn the soup, and I don't know, but you set the table properly. You got 2 out of 3 wrong. Well, maybe at that point it's time to start wondering if you're actually capable of completing a meal. But you don't want to jump from a single mistake at the higher level at the higher resolution level. You don't want to jump from a single mistake at that level to the next level. And the reason for that is that you'll get a cascade. Oh, I set the table badly. Error. That means I can't complete a meal. Error. That means I can't take care of my family. Error. That means I'm not a good parent. Error. That means I'm not a good person. That's what happens to depressed people. And I think what happens is their serotonin levels fall, right? They fall like serotonin levels fall if you're brought down a dominance hierarchy. Now we already know that if you live at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, you live where it's dangerous. And the reason for that is everything around you is already not good and you don't have a lot of social support. So you're sort of clinging desperately to the underside of life. And what that means is you probably can't even afford a single mistake. Your serotonin levels fall, and that allows error signals to propagate up the value system so that every little thing becomes a catastrophe. Now that in itself is a catastrophe, because if you're living at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy and you're already super stressed, the additional stress that you're likely to experience as a consequence of an additional error is going to be maybe push you over the limits. But the thing is that it is dangerous there. Now what seems to happen to people who are depressed is that their serotonin levels fall, roughly speaking, as if they've plummeted down a dominance hierarchy without actually having plummeted down it. So they're still competent, capable, and ensconced in their relatively productive environment, but they're reacting as if every little thing has become a catastrophe. And so partly what happens is if you provide people with serotonin reuptake inhibitors is that the propagation of negative emotion across these levels of value hierarchy seems to be reduced. So maybe then if it takes 2 errors at this level to trigger off an error message at that level, well, you're in a lot better shape, right? It's like a definition of resilience. So now you can also do that with people cognitively to some degree, you know, because maybe somebody will come to you in therapy and say, I had a bad day at work, my boss hates me, I'm going to lose my job, and then my marriage is going to dissolve. And so you walk them through it at a micro level. Okay, what exactly happened to you at work? And then they lay out the specific story. You say, well, what are the multiple ways that might be interpreted? And is there some possibility that it's not the catastrophe that you're envisioning, right? You get them to contextualize it and help them build up micro defenses. That might be one way of thinking about it. A lot of people who are prone to depression are not good at defending themselves, right? They don't have at hand the mechanisms to forgive themselves or even really to understand their own failure. Or even more importantly sometimes, they radically overestimate their own incompetence and radically overestimate the competence of everyone else.